Good morning. Hi. Oh, sorry. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and Tachidile. My name is Lakwanuri Serpa. I'm Environment Program Coordinator of ASEAN Indigenous Peoples Pact, and it's my utmost pleasure to welcome you all to our side event. This side event is co-organized by ASEAN Indigenous Peoples Pact, UNDP, and Forest Peoples Program, as well as UNDP program. AIPP is a regional organization, and we work in 14 countries in Asia with 46 members. AIPP is committed to the cause of promoting and defending indigenous peoples' rights and human rights, and articulating issues of relevance to indigenous peoples. AIPP, in partnership with our members and partners, have been doing a lot of work in the ground, at the national level, and also at regional and international level since 2009. And we have also produced a lot of policy papers, training manuals, videos, animations, and also documentary to build awareness raising, but also contribute in the policy work at different levels. And we're very proud to say that our knowledge products that we have produced in the context of Asia are also being contextualized, translated, and localized by indigenous peoples organizations in Africa and also in Latin America. And I think this also shows, even we come from different regions, but then how much our issues and the work that we do are very much interconnected. AIPP also has been actively working, especially in the climate change processes, as a focal point of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. So with the adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the establishment and operationalizations of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, and the submissions of the nationally determined contributions by the UNFCCC parties, AIPP and its member organizations and partner organizations felt the need to build and strengthen an evidence-based policy advocacy to really amplify the roles and contributions of indigenous peoples in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So with this background, AIPP did a series of consultations with its members and partners, and also eventually in partnership with the UNDP, Climate and Forest Team, and also with the Forest Peoples Program, we undertook an unprecedented policy research work in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Nepal, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, to really see how the rights, roles, and contributions of indigenous men, women, youth, and persons with disabilities are addressed in the national climate policies such as NDC. So the main objectives of our side event today is really to see what has come out from all the work that we have done in 10 countries, and really see what are the actions that we need to take forward from this point of time. So without much further ado, I would like to now invite our first speaker, Leticia Guma-Reyes. She's a senior global technical advisor for UNDP Climate and Forest Program, and she supports countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia Pacific on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, with a focus on promoting the transparency of the climate targets and enabling their access to performance-based finance for the forest sector. Leticia, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here representing UNDP in celebrating the launch of these reports that represent the culmination of 2 years of policy research by the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and the Forest Peoples Program into how the rights, roles, and contributions of indigenous peoples are recognized by climate policy frameworks across 10 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. As we all know, nationally determined contributions, or NDC as everyone calls them, is the backbone of the Paris Agreement and is the main way through which countries communicate their vision for the achievement of their climate targets. The forest and land use sector in particular has a great potential in terms of climate change mitigation and also in addressing or reversing the potential severe impacts of climate change. So this is a key opportunity to enhance ambition in tropical countries. The critical importance of forests has been recognized by different instruments and underscored recently by the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which was launched last year in November with the aim to strengthen political commitments and end deforestation by 2030. Forests are also central to the traditions and cultures and livelihoods of more than 70 million people around the world. And when you look at the forest data, it is on indigenous territories that forests are being preserved. So this shows the links between the traditional knowledge and the effective contribution to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Efforts to ensure that the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in climate mitigation and adaptation measures under the UNFCCC have been ongoing, and the establishment of the local communities and indigenous platforms was one of the important steps in that direction. In this context, UNDP's Climate Promise has been an initiative to try and incentivize over 120 countries to enhance their ambition and to also strengthen components such as the rights of indigenous peoples through their NDCs. Right now, on the second phase of the Climate Promise, which we call Climate Promise 2.0, nature is at the center of our efforts. UNDP is working through the Climate and Forest Program as well to accelerate the implementation of the NDCs by facilitating access to climate finance opportunities that adhere to high standards of social equity and environmental integrity. Human rights-based approach, promoting social inclusion and gender equality and the respect for the rights of indigenous peoples is central to UNDP work. The policy reports launched today by AIPP and the Forest People Program underscore this fact and add to the growing body of literature and media coverage that demonstrates that the climate policies need to clearly recognize indigenous women, men, youth, and persons with disabilities as right holders, knowledge holders, and more importantly, equal partners in the effort to combat climate change. The findings from these 10 Asian countries presented in the summary report as well as through the 3 sub-regional reports point to important areas that can be improved, and UNDP looks forward to continuing to collaborate with AIPP and Forest Peoples Program to address the gaps and continuously track how these NDCs are being implemented. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leticia, for sharing the work that UNDP is doing globally, but then really stressing on the need to have a human rights-based approach to all the climate action that if we really want to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much. So just to inform our participants now, we'll be moving to the stories from communities because that is also something you'll see strongly presented in this, the publications. You can, I think I'm still sure there are some publications there, the regional brief. So we'll move to the really listening the voices from the ground in terms of the actions that they are doing to combat with the climate change. So now we'll invite a very good friend who we are missing in this UNFCCC meetings is Tunga Vadrai, who I had also the privilege of working with him at different levels in terms of really making the indigenous voices very pronounced on climate change processes. Mr. Tunga belongs to the Rai indigenous nation of Nepal. He works with the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, and they have a specific program called Climate Change Partnership Program. He advocates human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples in national and international policies and mechanisms. So Tungaji will go ahead with the first story from Nepal, but just give me a second to share the slide.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lakpaji. And nice to see friends in the screen and also everyone there. Okay. Thank you. It is a big privilege to be a part of this study about Indigenous people contribution in NDC. So I'll be sharing one of the cases how Indigenous peoples practices and lifeways contribution and national contribution in the countries. So it's a small case from Nepal. So as you know that Nepal has 59 different indigenous nationalities recognized by the government of Nepal, and indigenous people constitute 37% of the population in the country. Can we go to the next slide? So indigenous peoples in Nepal live in mountains, hills, and in the lowlands. That means in all ecological zones in the country. Slide, please. Here I'm going to start from one indigenous nation living in the high mountain of Nepal. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please.
Sorry, Tungaji. I was inviting Onel on the panels. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So the story I'm presenting here is the story of indigenous peoples called Loba indigenous peoples living in highland. So Loba people are one of the marginalized indigenous peoples of Nepal living in the highland of the mountains. Next slide. So this is the village of Loba indigenous people, is homeland of those people about 3,800 meters above the sea level, and it's now the last forbidden kingdom. But very interestingly, the area, the village is governed and managed by the customary institution and customary law of indigenous peoples. You can see the ecology in the picture. It's very dry, it's very arid, so is the rain shadow of the Himalayas. Next slide, please. So the story here is that how and
Tungaji,
because
I think we're losing you. Hello?
can you not hear me?
Better. Please continue.
Okay. So it's simply because of indigenous institutions, indigenous customary law of indigenous people up in the mountains. Next.
Okay. Yes?
So next slide. This is how it looks like in the mountains. Please move quite.
Maybe, Tungaji, you can turn off your video if you are doing that, and then maybe the connection will be better.
Can we go to next slide?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so also you can see trees growing in dry land. Next slide.
Okay.
Potato.
Potato.
Wait, thank you. Buckwheat. Next. Multi crop growing in land. Next slide, please. So it's on only those indigenous people manage to irrigate by institution and customary values, and their distinct values regarding services as a form of deity. Next slide, please. It's the same, you know. This very dry land becomes a very fertile land for the agriculture by the help of indigenous institution and the customary law. Next slide, please. Again, Next slide. So the message here is that how this arid and dry land becomes a fertile land, and how to sustain and ecological environment is the values and the contribution that indigenous peoples' lifeways have in the place. Next slide. So simply, it's called adaptation. No, what the nationally determined contribution mean is also to incorporate adaptation practices, adaptation plans in climate action. The story that indigenous values, indigenous lifeways, there's a lot to describe the difference between and ultimately climate action and in condition in mountains. So it's really a one-way Paris Agreement and materialize nationally. If you look at the Paris Agreement, you can find the rights of indigenous people, the knowledge of non-carbon values of carbon market, and non-economic cost damage. So all of those things being the substantial mechanism the story that provide in the highland, making a dairy land, a fertile land, is really different. So this is what I'm here in a very short time. So stop. If you have anything. Which may,
Thank you very much, Tunga Ji. I think despite the issue of internet connection, you really present that photo story from the mountain region of Nepal, now where all those landscapes were super beautiful. But then I think you really highlighted how strongly the indigenous knowledge and science is strongly rooted to the customary institutions that they have among Loba indigenous peoples, and how it is central towards adapting to the climate and the environment that they are living in. Thank you, Tungaji. Stay with us. And now we will move to the story sharing from our sisters. No Min, she is the Executive Council member of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and she has also been working together with International Indigenous Forum on Climate Change for many, many years. So she brings that expertise of local, national, and also international level. So please go ahead and share your story.
Yeah. First, the community. Here, I prepare to give a case study and example. So I choose a community in Myanmar to share about their way of coping with climate change. No, the community I would like to highlight is in the middle of the country, and the community is 400 years old, and the people there are called Ashuching people, and then they are at the mountain range area. And they are living and their livelihoods also based on rotational farming and customary way of living there. And transportation with the main road in this region only started in 1993. So over the past year, they are just in the forest living, and not much, very remote, and not much to the outside community. And school, there is no school, and they have to do on their own, and they also have no healthcare service, so they rely more on traditional medicine, things like that. In terms of climate change, what kind of challenges they face at the moment is in their region, because they have very good trees and trees. So there are a lot of illegal logging happening with outsider pressure, a lot encroachment in their region, and because of cutting down a lot on the trees and deforestation. They also face with water scarcity and water shortage. And then they are very rich in biodiversity, but they also face with loss of biodiversity. And in terms of cultivation, there is like climate change that they really face, and early and late monsoon happening, which is very difficult for their cultivation. And land grabbing is similar in other Asia region. They are facing problem, for like mono plantation area, their land are grabbed. And lack of land tenure security is the thing that make them more vulnerable. And in addition to opening up of the main road, they also have problem with plastic waste and things like that. And that's why here we can see some of the things that the challenges they face are the cost to climate change, and some of them are the effect they get from climate change. So there is a link to local issue to global, and there is also a link to global impact to local issue, things like that. Next. I just want to show what is one of the example that how do they respond. No? This is a tree plantation happening on the Day of World Indigenous People on 9 August, just before the COVID. No? And I choose this photo because there is a monk and there is also some Christian, and you can see the indigenous women also involved. They are working together and at the grassroots level, and their action taken. Next. So in terms of action taken, slide is, go back. One,
Okay.
sorry. So actually, what do they do when they face with all of these things? First is like they protect and they carry on their indigenous knowledge. First is the language. They organize among themselves, trying to have their language learn, and all the indigenous knowledge related to the language, they try to preserve and protect and share and produce a kind of learning material, and they try to promote their indigenous knowledge. At the same time, like weaving and clothing, they are doing like that. And then they combat illegal logging. In the past, they even engage with a flag tea process, like the community organized among themselves, including youth and women. They are actively involved, and they monitor the situation in the forest. They inform to the local authority of any illegal logging happening, and there are certain cases they can stop those illegal logging. And awareness on environment issue, they trying to learn from the capacity building program that we are given. They try to learn and they share in the community. They spread out. They organize among themselves on those environment issues like climate change, biodiversity, things like that. And they also engage in campaign and advocacy, as I mentioned in the photo. They do certain activity like to protect on their environment and traditional medicine, and also tree plantation, and organize among themselves like that. And they patrol in the forest. Also, they organize among themselves to get a kind of training on how to conduct assessment, and they conduct assessment on biodiversity. They have this area, they have very good biodiversity. Certain endangered species are also in their forest area. So they conduct where are those monkeys in the forest nowadays. Although in the past they know where there are a lot of species there, but with those changes happening in climate change and loss of biodiversity, they conduct assessment again on their own way, so that they keep protect and identify area that should not be touched or should not bother for the biodiversity to not to lose their pasture, things like that. And also they are very active youth group on working on environment issue there. In our country, youth are not that active, but in this specific region, when they face a lot of challenges, this makes them stronger, and they come together and they work on those issues. And also shifting cultivation is their main livelihood, but because of loss of land, for shifting cultivation, we need to give a time to rest the land and things like that and move. But they have no more land left to move, and then some of them have to change to cash crop. things like that, and waste management they are doing. Also, because they collect garbage, plastic, they manage, or the issue threatening them. Next.
Yeah.
Way forward,
yeah.
no? And in terms of way forward, I just want to say that for a country like Myanmar, we need people to hear our voice and heal our hearts with all the problem facing, and we need helping hand and work in partnership. Although people cannot reach out, the community are still there. They will be there forever, and they will take care of their environment and biodiversity and combating climate change. So we need partnership for them, and we need to build more resilient in this time of crisis with all this COVID and other things happening. And we need to conduct more documentation, especially sharing of elder to future generation, like those things. And we need to continue protect and promote our rights. These are the things we're trying to work on, and we want to highlight left no one behind, and don't let left us as well. No? And next slide. This is just to show the photos that they do weaving, learning from different generation, and also tree plantation from one generation to another, working together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, EE, for really expounding the fight that communities are doing in the ground despite the issues of illegal logging and also the land grabbing, really organizing community and mobilizing young members of the community to really fight, and really also monitoring the biodiversity. And I think also you raise a very important point in terms of the need to document the work that communities are doing, and also to really have it transferred to the younger generations. Okay, we have one more story, and I think this is a community where our organization is based on in Thailand, in the northern part of Chiang Mai, and where I have been actually many times in this community, and this is where every time you visit this community, you learn something new. So this is a very powerful story we're going to hear now from Thailand, and it's my pleasure to invite our sister Noreri, who is also the first women chief of her village, and really trying to inspire the young women and girls in her community. Pinoreri, please go ahead with your sharing.
Okay. สวัสดีค่ะ
Just a second.
เดี๋ยวเรา
Oops. Just a second. Okay, please go ahead, Pinoreri.
ค่ะค่ะสวัสดีนะคะจากเครือข่ายสตรีชนเผ่านะคะผู้หญิงงานของผู้หญิงนะคะเพื่อที่จะสร้างการเปลี่ยนแปลงนะคะ
Yeah, my name is Noeri, and today I'm going to share about the Indigenous women, the agent of change.
ไปเลย
Next.
ค่ะอันนี้ก็คือก็อยากจะให้ดูรูปภาพไปด้วยนะคะเนื่องจากเวลามีจำกัดนะคะเราก็คิดว่าป่าคือชีวิตนะคะโดยเฉพาะป่าของพวกเราที่เป็นชนเผ่าพื้นเมืองนะคะป่าก็จะมีอยู่ที่หลากหลายป่าให้อาหารป่าให้สุขภาพป่าให้ความมั่นคงทางอาหารเนาะแล้วก็ป่าเราเชื่อมโยงกับพิธีกรรมนะคะในการอยู่ร่วมกันกับสรรพสิ่งในโลกนะคะแม้เราจะมองไม่เห็นนะคะเราก็จะมีส่วนร่วมเนาะแล้วก็ป่านะคะก็เป็นพื้นที่เรียนรู้นะคะกับรุ่นสู่รุ่นนะคะแล้วก็คนสู่คนนะคะ
For us Indigenous people, the forest is our life, and you can see from the picture represent how the forest meaning to us. So it's the part of our well-being, for our health, our food security, our spiritual, and also is the learning place for the outside and inside people.
Next. ค่ะในพื้นที่ของห้วยอีข้างนะคะเราก็มีอยู่ 10,000 ไร่นะคะพื้นที่ที่เราดูแลจัดการนะคะ 10,000 ไร่เนี่ยเราสามารถแบ่งออกเป็น 4-5 หดนะคะใน4-5 หดชั้นนะคะโดยเรามีอยู่เช่นเรามีป่าที่อยู่เรามีที่อยู่อาศัยนะคะที่ทำกินเนาะแล้วก็มีพื้นที่ป่าที่เราใช้สอยแล้วก็มีพื้นที่ของป่าที่เราดูแลหรือเราเรียกว่าป่าอนุรักษ์นะคะป่าอนุรักษ์ตัวนี้เนี่ยค่ะเราใช้โดยความเชื่อด้วยเนาะในการอนุรักษ์ป่านะคะ
In our village Hoi Ikang we manage 10,000 rai or around 1,600 hectares, which is 60% is the protected area. The community divided the land use by the residential area, farming area, and the community forest where people collectively can access and use. And then the last one is the protected area where our people using our customary practices or law and belief to manage this sacred area. Next.
ค่ะก็จะยกตัวอย่างนะคะในป่าที่เราบอกว่าป่าอนุรักษ์นะคะตามความเชื่อเนาะเราก็จะยกตัวอย่างของป่าเดปอเนี่ยมาเป็นความเชื่อของจิตวิญญาณปากญอนะคะที่มีความผูกพันกับต้นไม้นะคะโดยเฉพาะลูกนะคะที่เกิดใหม่เขาก็จะเอาสะดือใส่ในกระบอกไม้ไผ่แล้วก็ไปผูกกับต้นไม้ต้นนั้นเนี่ยปากญอเชื่อมั่นว่าเป็นขวัญของลูกนะคะที่เรียกว่าเดปอเขาบอกว่าลูกขวัญของลูกจะอยู่กับต้นเดปอจนวันตายนะคะอันนี้ก็เป็นการอนุรักษ์นะคะที่ผ่านความเชื่อแล้วก็วัฒนธรรมที่สืบทอดกันมา
I would like to give one example, like we are based on our beliefs that show the relationship between nature and human. No, the connection among us is close, like we respect each other. So this one is represent the soul and spirit, no, of the person that attached with the tree. So when you have a new baby born, they will put the baby umbilical cord in the bamboo and tie with the healthy tree, and no one allowed to cut down this tree because it is believed that the spirit or the soul of the baby, and when they grow until they die, the spirit is attached to the tree. Next.
ก็เราก็จะมีการบูรณาการความรู้นะคะความรู้ใหม่ๆกับความรู้เก่านะคะเข้ามานะคะเพื่อที่จะให้นะคะคนนะคะอยู่กับปัญญายั่งยืนนะคะโดยเฉพาะผู้หญิงชนเผ่านะคะเราก็มีการมันไม่เชิงกับว่าเราสร้างพื้นที่ใหม่นะคะแต่ว่าเป็นพื้นที่เก่าโดยเฉพาะพื้นที่ของเกินเนื้อมือเกินเนื้อพาอย่างนี้นะคะเพราะว่าปากญอเองผู้หญิงน่ะ100% นะคะที่มีความการพืชพันธุ์เนาะป่าก็ป่าเปรียบเสมือนธนาคารหรือว่าอาหารของเขาตัวนี้เนี่ยเราก็มีการจะทำเป็นเกินเนื้อมือเนาะเกินเนื้อมือเนี่ยเพื่อที่จะให้ผู้หญิงมีสุขภาพที่ดีนะคะเพื่อที่จะเดินหาอาหารแล้วก็สมุนไพรได้ในป่านะคะแล้วก็สามารถที่จะสืบทอดถ่ายทอดองค์ความรู้ของผู้หญิงให้กับลูกแล้วก็ให้กับเด็กเยาวชนในชุมชนได้นะคะแล้วก็อีกตัวหนึ่งที่คิดว่าป่าเกินเนื้อมือนะคะสามารถที่จะต่อจบนะคะเศรษฐกิจให้ผู้หญิงที่สามารถดำรงชีพนะคะอยู่ในป่าของเขาได้อย่างยั่งยืนนะ
So in the Hoi Ikang they have initiated the Indigenous Women's Forest, which is the transform from the term of Ganamu, where it's translated as women forest, no? And this what bringing the old and the new term to be together to create the forest area where that can provide the source of food, health, learning space for the young generation, and also to become the income generation for the women as well as the people in the community. Next, please.
ผู้หญิงเองนะคะเราก็สามารถนะคะอนุรักษ์แล้วก็จำแนกป่าในตัวผู้หญิงด้วยแล้วก็ในตัวของชุมชนด้วยนะคะซึ่งเราก็สามารถที่จะราวัดนะคะแนวเขตนะคะให้ผู้หญิงนะคะสามารถแผนที่ในชุมชนของเขาได้ตรงไหนที่มีการอนุรักษ์ตรงไหนที่ทำแนวกาไฟแล้วก็ตรงไหนที่สามารถลาดตระเวนนะคะพวกเราเองก็มีส่วนร่วมนะคะในการจัดกิจกรรมเหล่านี้ขึ้นมาโดยเฉพาะการจัดกิจกรรมนะคะเพื่อที่จะให้การมีส่วนร่วมในการดูแลป่าโดยชุมชนของเรานะคะจะเก็บนะคะภาษี ภาษีให้กับชุมชนนะคะคนละ38 บาทต่อคนต่อปีนะคะนี่ก็เป็นแนวคิดฐานที่มาจากผู้หญิงด้วยนะคะซึ่งการมีส่วนร่วมตัวนี้นะคะจะทำทุกๆปี
Yeah. So apart from using the forest, we also know how to manage the forest sustainably. No, so women are not only in the house or taking care of the household work, but we also take part of the solution that combat the climate change by to be part of the initiative. No, try to work together with men, women, and young people, no, for the forest management, such as we are making regular, like annually, the fire break and also patrolling. And women, they will go as a group, no, and like patrolling the forest because they regular go to the forest, often more than men. And also, the community itself also created the community tax, no, where the money will be using for taking care of the forest, no, like to pay for the gasoline or the equipment for when they doing the forest fire break area. Next.
อันนี้เราก็สามารถที่จะบอกว่าเราดูแลป่าก็ให้สิ่งดีๆกับเรามากมายนะคะโดยเฉพาะที่เราทำในไร่หมุนเวียนนะคะเมล็ดพันธุ์เหล่านี้ก็เป็นส่วนหนึ่งในการดูแลป่าเพราะว่าเราทำไร่หมุนเวียนน่ะผู้หญิงปากเกยอเราไม่ได้มองว่าการทำลายนะคะนี่ก็เป็นเพิ่มความหลากหลายให้กับอาหารนะคะแล้วก็การมีชีวิตนะคะแล้วก็วิถีชีวิตของปากเกยอนะคะซึ่งสิ่งเหล่านี้เนี่ยก็สามารถสร้างความมากด้านอาหารแล้วก็เพิ่มความหลากหลายให้กับองค์ความรู้ของคนในชุมชนนะคะแล้วก็พูดถึงอาหารที่เพียงพอแล้วก็อาหารที่สามารถจะตอบโจทย์เด็กเยาวชนในอนาคตด้วยนะคะ
And one of the part of our livelihood, no, rotational farming is one of the key source, and also one of our practice that how the people or human can live in harmony with nature, no. By doing this rotational farming or shifting cultivation, we able to conserve like the diversity of the seeds, no, the traditional seed, where it's resilient to the climate, and also like the women are the one that holding the knowledge on this seeds biodiversity, no, and we also transfer this knowledge to our young generation. And this is the source of our food, not only among our household or among our community, but this is also can be the future source of food for the world, no, when we are facing any scarcity of the food, no. So keeping the traditional seed is really the key for the food security and also to combat with the climate change, no. Next.
ค่ะผู้หญิงนะคะผู้หญิงชนเผ่านะคะเราไม่ใช่กลุ่มเปราะบางนะคะจะบอกว่าเราไม่ใช่กลุ่มเปราะบางนะคะเพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยองค์ความรู้ของผู้หญิงแล้วก็ผู้หญิงชนเผ่าพื้นเมืองนะคะมีความสำคัญมากแล้วก็องค์ความรู้เหล่านี้เนี่ยจะต้องให้โลกหรือว่าสังคมน่ะยอมรับว่าผู้หญิงสามารถสร้างการเปลี่ยนแปลงได้แล้วก็สามารถรับมือกับการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศได้แล้วก็สามารถที่จะถ่ายทอดองค์ความรู้ให้กับคนรุ่นหลานแล้วก็ชุมชนนะคะเพื่อให้เกิดการดำรงชีวิตแบบยั่งยืนแล้วก็สมดุลนะคะเพื่อที่จะอยู่ในพื้นที่ของเขาได้ด้วยความปลอดภัยแล้วก็มากคนนะคะ
Yeah, so I would like to give my final message, no. I want people to see us indigenous women not as the vulnerable people, but we are really like creative and resilient. We hold the indigenous knowledge that passed down for many generations, no, that to keep us safe and we live with dignity and security. So we really need the people to respect our indigenous people right and also our knowledge, no, contribution to this. And I want everyone to really have the mind shift, no, to see women in different perspective, and we are the one that can change the future together with everyone as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed, Pinot, indigenous women are agents of change, no? And the leadership that you have played in Huekang village is central towards the biodiversity protection, the biocultural, the diversity that you have, and also really having that concept of indigenous women forest to really have that natural classroom for the transfer of knowledge from one generation to another. That is something very, very unique. And thank you also, Pinoreri, for agreeing to come from your village because the issue of internet, so she agreed to travel from a village to AIPP office. She is in our office now. And really thank you for your sharing. Okay, we have more stories, but now we'd like to change the sharing a bit in terms of the findings, because there are many stories like this in our publications. There are stories from, like I said, 10 countries. So we'd like to move ourselves to the findings and recommendations that has come out from 10 countries. And to do the sharing on findings and recommendations, there will be a joint presentation from AIPP and Forest Peoples Program. And from AIPP, our chairperson, Kitisak Ratana Krajansri, Kitisak, hopefully I pronounce it right, and Oda Almas Smith will be making a joint presentation. Kitisak is an indigenous person, and he belongs to Lumian indigenous group from the north of Thailand. Besides AIPP, he's also the chair of the Council of Indigenous Peoples in Thailand. He has worked to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples since 1989, particularly focusing on land and natural resource issues. Oda has worked in solidarity with indigenous peoples, both on the ground, with communities, and also in the international policy processes for over a decade to secure their rights. She is with Forest Peoples Program for the last 8 years and is currently the coordinator of the Responsible Finance Program. She has a background on international human rights law with a focus on indigenous people's rights and in anthropology. So Kitisak and Oda, please share the findings and recommendations of the
Thanks, Lakpa. I think we're waiting for the presentation, right?
Just
Sure.
a second.
Yeah.
I have to go to the... And then this one. Can you see it?
Yes,
Okay.
great.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. So the first slide, Lakpa, please. So to start, let's just look at the context and the rationale for this research. Lakpa, if you might want to change to the first slide. So the collective rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination, to lands, territories, and resources, and to AIPP are protected and confirmed in a growing body of international human rights law. And due to the persistent advocacy over many years by the global indigenous movement, these rights are gradually being explicitly acknowledged in the international climate change framework. For example, in COP21 decisions and the Paris Agreement from 2015, they contain some important provisions on indigenous people's rights and knowledge and role in climate actions. Those include, for example, the preamble to the Paris Agreement, which acknowledges that parties, when taking action to address climate change, should respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations and human rights, including the rights to indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. And the COP decision that adopted the Paris Agreement also states that COP recognizes the need to strengthen knowledge and efforts of local communities and indigenous peoples. And it established what we know today as the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And in addition to these general provisions, the UNFCCC parties have explicitly acknowledged that adaptation actions should follow country-driven, gender-responsive approaches, and should be based on and guided by knowledge of indigenous peoples. Lakpa, I can only see the very, very first slide. I wonder if you can put the next one up.
The process, the one with the...
Oh, no, I just see. Okay, maybe you have the right one.
I think... Can you help?
If it's on there, it's fine.
Just a second, I think...
I only see the very
issue.
first
Just a second.
kind of...
Okay, yes.
Oh yeah,
yes, go
that's
ahead.
it. Yeah, that's it. That's what I was talking to. So all of what I just said suggests that the parties to the Climate Change Convention agree that the rights of Indigenous peoples and of women and of youth and of persons with disabilities should be respected and promoted in climate actions, and that Indigenous peoples are agents of with valuable contributions to global efforts to address climate change. So the question that this research set out to answer was, how are these commitments by states being implemented into national level climate change policies? And it has also been very important to start documenting the various ways that Indigenous peoples are contributing to global climate mitigation adaptation efforts, which we have heard some very powerful examples of just now. Next slide, please. So before we jump into the findings, we just wanted to say a little bit about the process of this work. The project started in September 2020, with the actual research starting in April 2021. And as some people have said already, the results is 10 country reports, one regional report synthesizing the findings of the country reports. And as you see on this slide, many people have been involved in the collaborative development of and the completion of the various reports. So in total, there are 12 local authors, a majority of them Indigenous themselves, who have led the research on the drafting of the country reports. They all have close connections with Indigenous networks and movements in their countries, as well as deep understandings of the national climate policy processes. And the people involved in the regional report development include colleagues in AIPP, in UNDP, and myself and my colleagues, some of my colleagues in Forest Peoples Program. And going forward, we just want to say that this work will be the baseline for AIPP and its members and partner organizations working on climate change and Indigenous people's rights, to monitor and track change in national level policies. Next, please. Presented here by the logos, you see the organizations who've been involved in the work. And when it comes to funding, I should mention that the work has been funded by the UNRED program through UNDP, with additional contributions from the Development Cooperation section of the Swedish Embassy in Bangkok and the Swedish Development Agency. And at the bottom, you see the logos of the contributing organizations who the national authors are associated with. Next, please. And I think it's over to Kitisak.
Okay, thank you very much, Oda. So before going into the main findings and recommendations, just like to quickly share a few general information about Indigenous people in Asia. Firstly, 2/3 of approximately 370 million self-identified Indigenous people are in Asia. This enriches the region's enormous cultural and linguistic diversity. Secondly, there are different names that government and others use to refer to Indigenous people collectively. For example, like ethnic minorities, tribal people, island people, original people, native people, and also many others. Some of these terms, however, are not appreciated by many Indigenous people, since they often imply notion of cultural inferiority, primitiveness, or backwardness. Next. Yeah, this one actually is about to introduce the AIPP. Since Lakpa already mentioned at the beginning, I just quickly show this picture where AIPP members are locating in 14 countries. And yeah, we have altogether 47 member organizations. Yeah, for more information, you can go to the website at below for the detailed information. Next. Okay, now we are going into the regional analysis and finding. The first finding that we got from all the country case study is about the general status of indigenous people in focus countries. From the regional summary and analysis, there are 7 major findings. The first finding is about the general status of indigenous people. We find that all countries supported the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, except Bangladesh. And legal recognition of indigenous people collective rights varies between countries participated in this study. For example, Philippines indigenous people's rights are recognized in the Constitution 1987 and Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act 1997. In Indonesia, Constitution 1999 contains provision for recognition of traditional rights of indigenous people. And Constitutional Court 2013 also confirmed indigenous people's rights over their land and territories, including collective rights over traditional forests. Other countries, indigenous people legal rights is less clear because of their national legal framework contain internal contradictions. This, for example, in Cambodia, land law 2001 recognized indigenous community to collective ownership of their land, while the forestry law 2002 has not recognized such rights. It's conflicting to each other. In Nepal, Constitution 2015 merely recognized the multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious, and multicultural characteristics of the country. Bangladesh Constitution refers only to the protection of culture, not related to land and resource rights. In Thailand, Constitution 2019 recognized ethnic group rights to live in the society according to the traditional culture, custom, and way of life, but has not specified who ethnic groups are. This provides very weak protection for indigenous people. In all the countries, regardless of legal protection, the reality is that indigenous men, women, youth, and persons with disability are facing social, political, cultural, and economic discrimination and threat to land, forests, and waters. They are often criminalized for carrying out activities, example like shifting cultivation and or protecting their territory. Next. Yeah, for the second finding on indigenous people and climate change impact. All of the countries study experience the impact of climate change, particularly on unpredictable weather patterns, such as increased rainfall, longer and more frequent droughts, more floods, soil erosion, wildfires, landslides, destruction of arable lands, sea level high. These changes lead to the damage of to their farms, reduced yield of subsistence, disruption of food and water collection practices, threat to physical and mental health, disruption to family relations, and also disruption of knowledge and transmissions. Yeah, okay, back to you, Oda.
Thank you. Yeah, the findings here when it comes to how rights are protected and included in the national climate policies are grouped into NDCs and other climate policies on the one hand, excluding the red policies, and then the red policies on the other hand. And the general takeaway from the analysis of the first bucket is that with very few exceptions, Indigenous peoples are invisible as rights holders and as knowledge holders and agents of positive change. Instead, they're usually featured as victims of climate change or participants or beneficiaries of climate change plans, projects, and funds. And when Indigenous peoples are mentioned in terms of their participation in implementation of climate actions, their traditional knowledge is sometimes acknowledged, at least in 3 of the NDCs, as valuable to mitigation and adaptation efforts. None of the NDCs acknowledge that land on which many of the efforts will be undertaken, as part of the NDCs, is under the customary land ownership of Indigenous peoples. However, the Cambodia's NDC does state that during implementation, the government will seek to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples concerning land ownership. And the NDC of Nepal sets as a goal that by 2030, it will have institutional mechanisms and structures in place and an adequate budget to ensure that the free, prior, informed consent, the forest tenure of Indigenous peoples is secured, and that access to finances, technology, and contributing to that also. In addition to these few examples, the NDCs of Indonesia and the Philippines make general reference to human rights obligations, including the rights of Indigenous peoples. And most of the country reports found that the participation of Indigenous peoples in the development of the NDCs has been minimal, and where it has existed at all, it has been due to consistent pressure by Indigenous organizations in that country, not due to an invitation from the government side. So when it comes to the RED policies, they are among all the climate-related policies reviewed for this study. They are those that most consistently contain language and provisions on Indigenous peoples' rights. The importance of Indigenous peoples' participation is the most frequent mention, and in some cases with reference to ethics. Land tenure is referenced in a number of strategies as well, in relation to the need for tenure reform to clarify ownership. However, in most of those instances, it's not expressly stated that whether the foreseen tenure reform will formally recognize the customary land rights of Indigenous people. While the RED processes are consistently highlighted in the country reports as those paying the most attention to inclusiveness in their development and design, the substance of that inclusion seems to vary. And in some countries, participation has focused on awareness raising and capacity building with the aim of enabling informed consultation. Yet in many countries, for example, Nepal, Indigenous peoples report that they have very limited knowledge, and even if they were invited to be consulted on the topic, the consultation wouldn't be informed. Next, please. The research has had as a particular emphasis or focus on finding out whether the national climate change policies specifically reference Indigenous women, Indigenous youth, and Indigenous persons with disabilities, and if so, to what extent and in what ways. What we found was that these groups, including their key role in helping to protect nature and combat climate change, receive very little attention in the climate policies reviewed. Indigenous women and Indigenous youth are mentioned in policies in 2 of the countries. For example, in Vietnam, there is a reference to recognition of that women, especially ethnic minority women, are highly vulnerable to climate change. And in Cambodia, the NDC contains as an action to reduce climate change vulnerabilities of marginalized groups such as ethnic minority women. So in summary, while particular reference to Indigenous women, Indigenous youth, and Indigenous persons with disabilities are rare or non-existent, where the broader categories of women, youth, and persons with disabilities are mentioned, it is often to emphasize their vulnerability, not their unique knowledge or agency. Next, please. The 10 country reports record a set of concerns by Indigenous peoples that the climate change policies fail to address or that they inadequately address. The concerns most frequently highlighted are that climate policies almost exclusively fail to address land tenure insecurity caused by a lack of legal recognition of customary land rights and the related threats to traditional livelihoods faced by Indigenous people. And in several instances, the policies even contribute to the criminalization of traditional sustainable practices by defining them, for example, as drivers of deforestation. And further, with land tenure issues remaining unaddressed, the increasing amounts of and sources of international finance associated with schemes set up to reward and compensate, for example, storage of carbon in forests, such as RED, could entail a risk that states will move to take control over untitled lands, as well as the financial benefits.
Yeah, I know.
So concerns around the lack of broad and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in climate processes, especially of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, were also raised in some of the studies. And many of these concerns mentioned now, they have their base in experiences with environmental and climate policies implemented to date. So while many of the plans we reviewed for this study, like the ones in the NDCs, are yet to be implemented, it is likely that the impact experienced with previous environmental and climate policy projects will be repeated unless underlying issues are addressed. And impacts that were highlighted in this study include supposedly climate and forest-friendly projects that are being implemented on Indigenous peoples' lands without their free, prior, and informed consent, and the fining and even imprisonment of women, Indigenous men and women, for carrying out their traditional activities on their own lands. Next, please. Some of the country reports highlighted possible routes in which the existing climate policy through the existing climate policy framework, through which the inadequacies outlined above could be addressed. For example, in the Philippines, Indigenous peoples are seeking to bring attention to the need for land tenure security through what is referred to as non-carbon benefits in the national RED process. And in Bangladesh, one of the RED strategy targets is to survey and demarcate 1 million hectares of forest land to resolve land ownership disputes. So, where climate policies are catalyzing governments to clarify land tenure rights, this might present a rare opportunity for Indigenous peoples to advocate for this clarification to be in line with their state's international commitments to uphold Indigenous peoples' rights and hence drive legal reform in the country. And the fact that many climate programs and financial mechanisms require the participation of Indigenous peoples, for example, in technical working groups, also represents an opportunity. It may facilitate spaces where Indigenous representatives can engage with governments and in intergovernmental funding mechanisms and advocate for direct support by existing climate programs to Indigenous people's own mitigation and adaptation actions. Over to you, Lakpa. No, not Lakpa, over to you, Kitty.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. On Indigenous people contribution to mitigation and adaptation, I think that this section is really well connected to earlier speakers on the community solutions. I think that that's quite clear example, like Indigenous people protecting forest and biodiversity through customary rules and practices. Indigenous people directly dependent on resources, allowing them for their food, water, medicines, animal husbandry, and general well-being. So they therefore have to sustainably managing and protecting their natural resources. It is deeply embedded and integrated in their custom, rules, knowledge, traditional practices, and innovation. Much of the planted biodiversity and the carbon is stored in soil and biomass of land managed by indigenous people and local communities. So that's by increasing external pressure on their land. It is still regularly found that forests and other ecosystems within areas managed by indigenous people are in better health than nature outside this area. And on customary sustainable use of natural resources through traditional livelihoods. I just give an example on chipping cultivation or rotational farming. There are around 7 to 10 plots of land used for such kind of farming. Each plot will be used for 1 year, then it will live for a fallow for a period of 7 to 10 years and be used for farming again. Such kind of practice is considered carbon neutral or able to capture more carbon. Studies have found that the amount of carbon stored in plants and in the soil during the fallow period, plants use carbon to grow stems and leaves. It's significant and far exceeds the amount of carbon dioxide released during clearing or burning of the land. Aside from this, there are more than 50 varieties of vegetables grown in the rotational farming. This will enhance food security for the villagers and keeping traditional knowledge and seeds alive. On maintaining and transferring knowledge and wisdom on how to adapt to harsh climatic conditions, women have played key roles on knowledge transmission to the young generation. Some example, like we already heard from Noeli, a natural classroom of the Waikam village. Another example from Indonesia is a project that Aman conducted to encourage young people returning to their communities, applying their skill and knowledge in the village, and also develop a business plan to support the community. The last one, to maintain resilient and diverse food system. Each community has to ensure that there are enough foods for family consumption, such as from terrace paddy, rotational farming, gardens, from rivers, and from the forest. Just to give example, in Thailand, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many indigenous communities closed their villages and able to stay there for a very long time without contacting with the outside. Just an example how they're able to sustain the community. Next, over to you, Oda.
Yeah, so the overall recommendation coming out of this study is that national climate policies must clearly recognize Indigenous men, women, youth, and persons with disabilities as rights holders, as knowledge holders, and equal partners in efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And next. And in the short term, states must ensure the full and effective participation of Indigenous men, women, youth, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of the existing climate policies and NDCs. They must build the capacity of regional and local government bodies and other actors responsible for overseeing climate policy implementation when it comes to Indigenous people's rights and roles, to ensure that that rights that are respected on paper are also implemented in reality. States must promote the important roles that Indigenous men, women, and youth and persons with disabilities already play in addressing climate change, which we've heard so many examples of today. And they must establish local and national level mechanisms to really allow Indigenous men, women, and youth and persons with disabilities to actively participate in climate policy processes. Over to you, Kitisak.
Okay, on the recommendation for the medium term, 2 to 5 years, states must initially fully participate in the process with dedicated budget for revision of national level climate policy including the NDCs, to ensure that they explicitly recognize and reward indigenous people's historical and ongoing defense and maintenance of nature and climate, including through the full recognition of customary land tenures, including indigenous tenure security, traditional knowledge, and traditional livelihood as climate solution necessary to reach the goal of the Paris Agreement. Set out our plans for how to monitor and report on the implementation of these solutions in partnership with indigenous people organizations. Clearly acknowledge that the land on which many mitigation and adaptation projects are planned are under the customary ownership of indigenous people, and that any development affecting this land must respect self-determination of indigenous people. Next. Yeah, the next one also, request the state to initiate law reform processes with the full and effective participation of indigenous people with the aim of securing customary land and resource rights in national law. Safeguarding contained in climate policy are unlikely to be successfully implemented if based on national legislation that is more regressive than policy. Last but not least, there should be a more holistic approach for the recognition of and support for indigenous people's contribution, knowledge, rights, and role in climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development in a synergistic way. Next. Yeah, here is the last slide. The country case studies and also the regional case studies that we conducted over the last 2 years. Yeah, some of them I think that are made available in the side event room. But however, there are only a few copies left. So if you want to get more information, please go to the link as provided in the slide from the AIPP website, Forest People's website, and also the Climate and Forest UNDP website. Yeah, for downloading the document. Yeah, so that you can go into more detail of the publication of the case studies. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pikky Tisak, and thank you, Oda. Great teamwork, great presentations. And I know it's how difficult it is to summarize the 2 years' work into 30 minutes presentation. No? I'm sure there are questions that our participants would like to interact with you, Oda and Pikky Tisak, and of course the community speakers. But then before that, I would like to now move to interact with one of our very well-known sister. I'm sure many of you know her. We have invited her here to actually share her reflection. And this is very much strongly connected to the global leadership that International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change has been providing to really have that political space for indigenous peoples in the context of climate change. So we have worked as AIPP with Hindu for so many years, and also in the context of when the parties were preparing their INDC and then NDC, and then also in the Paris Agreement when we really wanted that rights of indigenous peoples and human rights at the central of the Paris Agreement. So Hindu, hearing to what communities from different countries and also listening to what Oda and Kitisak has presented, what is your takeaway in terms of how, of the findings that has come out, and what would be the next step forward or call to action for indigenous peoples in general? So Hindu, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Lakpa, for the invitation, and thank you also for the presentations online. Even Tungau couldn't come, but we are happy to see you all online there. Firstly, congratulations for the work that you did for the 2 years, working at the community level and involving women and working in the different ecosystem. So that is what is needed, because at the international level, when we need action at the local level, that's what we are expecting and what we wanted to see. And just to let me remind you through all the NDCs, because we are talking about the NDCs. So the 151 countries that presented their NDCs. So if we look at how much of them mention it, just the indigenous peoples, we did the analysis at the activity night of the facilitative working group, and we found that so less of them that just mentioning indigenous peoples. So 17 only like mention of indigenous peoples. And when we look at through all the more than 500 documents that we analyze, that's including the NDCs, the NAPs, the national communications, etc. So all those documents, you have 18 parties that made 30 reference on indigenous people rights. And then you say like, what is the meaningful when you look at this work of the underground, how the peoples are working and who are doing the implementation of the adaptation and mitigations. So there is a lack, as they highlighted there. So the lack is coming from the international level. I think there is no more inclusion or indications of the indigenous peoples that are playing the role at the local level. They are the ones who are implementing all the decisions that are taken here. So this is one of my takeaway. There is need of putting coherence between what we are discussing here and what we are implementing at the local level. It is not two decisions at all. It is one decision and it's going one way. So when we take the decisions by excluding the peoples who are implementing, that means the impact at the local level can be seen and we do not make a lot of progress. So the NDC's revisions here, we have just 11 countries that revised. Still, we have more than 149 that have to revise the existing one. So they must absolutely include the indigenous peoples knowledge, recognize the rights into the design of the NDCs. It is not the document that they must do by a consultant at the office. It is the document that they must consult with the peoples who have the different livelihood. As we saw here, the different landscape and livelihood that are building all the activities and mitigating the climate effect. So the objective of having the NDCs, it's how they can have a pathway to reduce the emissions. And if those who are protecting the ecosystem that are reduce the emissions are not included, it cannot work. Second, we need to see how those documents can be translated into a program and project at the local level. It is not only a showing documents or lobbying documents from the countries, but they must turn it into a real action on the ground, and real action might be only a long-term program and then a short-term project at the local level by the communities, including the women, because we saw that the women are playing a big role on all those maintaining of the ecosystem. And another point that I saw in all the presentations is the various ecosystems, from the forest to the mountain, to the land, to the grass, etc. So how the ecosystems can be taken into considerations in their diversity, not on choosing who is helpful for the NDCs and who is not. And that can link to the point on how we can have adaptation and mitigations all both working for the communities at the local level. And the last point is, this is relevant to all the countries. You did the exercise in Asia, but it can be a great exercise for all the rest of the 7 regions of the indigenous peoples, because that's how we can show the concrete examples of the decision that take it at the international level. How the communities, like the mom who do not speak English, but who know his land better than someone who can translate for her, can be included. So it is happening in so many regions of indigenous peoples. And we need to have this mom and many other moms like her to take the floor, to share their knowledge, and to implement it. So that's why the knowledge sharing for us is really very important at the international level. And we need the direct access finance for her. You cannot ask this mom to fill an Excel sheet to report back a financial complications. But she can report back on how she's doing with her grandchildren and how she's maintaining her ecosystem. So how the system of implementation of all NDCs can respect the way of working of the communities, but not how the community can respect the way of working of the NDCs. So it has to be a paradigm shift from the communities to up. Thank you so much, Lakpa.
Thank you very much, Hindu. It's always a pleasure having you on board, that you provide interesting and different perspective and really call for actions for also other reasons how relevant this work that we have done in Asia as well. We still have one more speaker before we open the floor for questions. And I think many of you who are actively engaging in the climate and also the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, I think you have started seeing that the point where everything comes together. And I think the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity are really also trying to have that a very coherent and consolidated approach in terms of really hitting this crisis of both biodiversity and climate. And of course, where Indigenous proposals is really putting that Indigenous land tenure security as a solution to both crises, right? And in that kind of struggle in the international level, our brother Onel has been engaging in both process, also in the CBD and also in the climate. And I have learned a lot, because when I was doing the CBD and the climate, I was very young. So it's like I also got an opportunity to learn and engage together with a bigger group of Indigenous peoples at the international level. So I would like to invite our brother Onel to also share his perspective in terms of the work that we have done in the region, and also see how relevant it is to your region, and also maybe also give a bit of perspective in terms of, as a newly elected co-chair of the facilitative working group members, how do you see this work that we have done in the Asia region? And he has said he will say in English, which is very great. Brother Onel, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I need support for translation because my English is not good. Yeah, but please, Aileen here, please.
Oh, you have a mic there. But you can come and sit next to you.
Okay.
Maybe they have question for you.
En nombre del grupo facilitador de la plataforma de comunidades locales y pueblos indígenas, quiero agradecer la oportunidad que nos brinda.
I want to say thank you for the opportunity in name of the Indigenous people, the local community and Indigenous people platform.
Yo creo que la presentación del libro y las historias que presentaron es un ejemplo vivo de cómo los pueblos indígenas podemos contribuir a la NDC.
The presentation of the studies and the different story is a live example of how Indigenous people can contribute to the NDCs.
Y los temas que han abordado, como gobernanza, los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, los roles de las mujeres, son temas relevantes a todos los pueblos indígenas, independientemente de las regiones que estemos.
And all the issues that were raised here about governance, territorial governance, Indigenous people, women, all these issues are relevant for Indigenous people at the global level. It's not specific for one group.
Y una de las cosas que yo creo que con eso demostramos a las partes en estas reuniones, cómo los indígenas realmente contribuimos, que no solamente nuestra posición son posiciones políticas, sino posiciones de que las experiencias que tenemos de nuestras comunidades.
And we are showing here to the state parties that indigenous people don't not only present political position, we are contributed at local level with these different action and activities that we're doing.
Nosotros sabemos como pueblos indígenas cómo nuestro pueblo se ha hecho frente a los cambios climáticos basado en sus conocimientos indígenas en mitigación, adaptación y la resiliencia.
We know as indigenous people how to tackle climate change in relation to mitigation, adaptation, and resilience.
Yo creo que con esa presentación y viendo el programa de trabajo de la plataforma de comunidades locales y pueblos indígenas, es un reto para nosotros como miembros del facilitador de cómo apoyar ese proceso.
Seeing this seeing all these examples is also a challenge for the facilitator working group of the platform, how to support all this process at local level.
Porque yo creo que nosotros necesitamos este tipo de publicaciones que realmente demuestre la experiencia nuestras.
We need all these studies that can show the experience of indigenous people at local level.
Esto hay que reconocer tanto en el CBD y en el cambio climático, los hermanas de Asia han llevado la delantera.
We have to recognize in CBD process and also in climate change that our sisters and brothers for Asia are taking the lead in all these studies.
Y puede ser como guía para que otras regiones de pueblos indígenas podamos impulsar ese tipo de publicaciones.
And this can be a guide for other indigenous people around the world to do this kind of studies and publications.
Por último, tengan la seguridad de que como copresidente del grupo facilitador, nosotros presentaremos como parte del plan de trabajo impulsar estas publicaciones, investigaciones y trabajo de los pueblos indígenas.
But you have to be sure that as co-chair of the facilitator working group, we're going to include this kind of studies so other people can do it at local level.
Así que bueno, le felicito por esa iniciativa y deseo éxitos y yo creo que es una experiencia enriquecedora para todos nosotros.
I really congratulate you with for this experience, and this is a very enriched experience for all other indigenous people, and thank you.
Thank you very much, brother, and also accepting this very short notice invitation to you. We'll definitely, like you have said, submit all the reports to the facilitative working group on local communities and indigenous peoples platform so that it's also be highlighted in the web portal that you have. Okay, I'm looking at the time. We have 2 minutes, and if there is any burning question that you would like to ask to any of our speaker, or would like to share anything, maybe we just limit to 1 because we have very limited time. Yes, brother, please introduce yourself and go ahead with your video.
Okay, thank you very much, and congratulations for the amazing work you've been doing far away from Latin America, where I am from. My name is Edson Krenak. My question is is just one simple. Do you know what is the perception and the idea or support that the civil society have for your work? Because sometimes in Brazil we have both sides, pro and also on our side, civil society, the non-indigenous society. I'm not talking about politicians, I'm talking about other groups.
Thank you very much for that acknowledgement of the work that we have done in narration and also asking that questions. Pikitisak or Oda, would you like to take that on?
Thank you, Tisak. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I will just quickly respond to that. Yeah, for the it depends on the context because, like you mentioned, that for the civil society groups, they are so different. Yeah, like you mentioned, of course, yeah, some of them also closely work with indigenous people issue, and some of them they work on other issues not much relevant to indigenous people. So yeah, I don't know how to answer to that. That's why it depends on the different context in different countries. Yeah, it depends on the nature of the organization. But for those who already supporting indigenous people, yeah, of course, yeah, that also quite well coordinate, yeah, with indigenous people on the ground and work on different levels. Yeah, maybe just very short response to that.
Thank you very much, Pikitisa. Tungaji or anybody who are online would like to contribute to this? Yeah, it's the time is off. But I think we can continue this conversation outside this room as well in terms of how we work in the region and what are the complementation and synergy that we provide. We have a lot of stories to share. Maybe we can continue our conversation outside. But I would like to acknowledge, I think, a very good number of presence of participants from various sectors. And thank you very much for coming and listening to our authors, but most importantly, listening to the communities from the ground who are the main source of all the actions that we are advocating at different levels. So thank you very much, and let's give a big round of applause for everybody for this very good participation. And please get some publications. I'm not sure if it's still there, but then please go to our websites, and it's there for you to download. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.